Good evening. Can you hear me okay? In addition to beginning with my own thank yous to Bernie and Bruno, I also begin with a sigh because Indiana's loss is your very considerable gain, as you just heard from your new provost. I'm happy to be here as part of this interesting conference and hope to add my own thoughts of a kind that will engage you in this following talk. I would like to introduce my reflections this evening by posing the following question, which was already cribbed from my talk by Bruno and mentioned a couple of times, but that's okay. The question is, do the humanities humanize? George Steiner, in particular, raises this issue in his 1967 book, Language and Silence, with the crimes of the Third Reich prominently in mind. I quote from Steiner, "It's not only the case that the universities, the arts, the book world failed to offer adequate resistance to political bestiality, they often rose to welcome it and give it ceremony and apology. Why?" The history of academic compromise and complicity during the Third Reich has been studied by numerous scholars now, and we've been hearing from them in the most updated way during this conference. The first, as already has been mentioned in our sessions, was Max Weinreich, whose still valuable pioneering book of 1946 entitled Hitler's Professors offers an abundance of evidence to demonstrate the role of scholarship in Germany's crimes against the Jews. Weinreich cites many German scholars by name and shows how, in their zeal to propagate the tenets of racial science and the so-called German spirit, they helped to align Germany's institutions of higher learning with the ideological and political goals of the national government. The Nazi regime's efforts to co-opt German academicians were widespread. Eric Weitz talked in particular detail today about the historians among them. Working within the established universities, but also within newly fashioned research institutes devoted to addressing the Jewish question, these scholars actively pursued teaching and research agendas that would advance such spurious notions as political biology, racial hygiene, Aryan mathematics, German physics, and other pseudoscientific fields. In the words of Carl Schmitt, their work was integral to winning what he called a fateful ideological contest with Jewry, a contest whose ultimate aim, and again I'm quoting Schmitt, was to free the German spirit from all Jewish falsifications. In material terms, this contest was an uneven one, and in short order, most Jewish scholars and Jewish students were expelled en masse. According to Jeremy Noakes, between 1933 and 1938, 3,120 German academics left Germany, of whom 756 were the equivalent of our full professors. And among those who left were many of the ablest scholars in Germany, including 24 existing and future Nobel Prize winners. Many of these scholars were Jews. As for the non-Jews who stayed on, with only few exceptions, most offered no significant moral or political resistance to the dismissal of their Jewish colleagues and students. Many actively contributed to making scholarship subservient to the political requirements of the Nazi state. In Jeremy Noakes' assessment, and I quote him, "The most striking feature of the history of universities in the Third Reich is the relative ease with which they adapted themselves to the new order. Indeed, many German academics actually welcomed and eagerly cooperated with a movement and a regime which were blatantly at odds with the traditional values of their profession. Noting the extent to which German academics were involved in some of the worst crimes of the Third Reich, Noakes does not hesitate to call their behavior, and these are his words, treason in the ivory tower. My colleagues in this conference are examining the forms such treason took during the Third Reich. My task is different, for I've been asked to take a hard look at today's universities and identify any analogous developments. Might such scrutiny uncover signs of a contemporary betrayal of the humanities? This is an unnerving but necessary question, and I'll do my best to address it in as clarifying and sober a manner as I can. On the positive side, nothing remotely akin to the kind of academic collusion with a dictatorial state that occurred during the Hitler period is observable within our institutions of higher learning today. No efforts are apparent to reproduce or inculcate nationalist or ideological tendencies like the German spirit, or to cleanse Jewish books and authors from university libraries, or to remove Jewish professors or Jewish students from institutions of higher learning on racial or religious grounds. In all of these respects, Western universities are by and large free of the kinds of professional deformations that the Nazification of scholarship introduced into German universities. During the Hitler period, matters had reached the point where the German political philosopher Bruno Aumann could propose, and I quote him, that there should be no German university in the country that would not have at least one chair focused on the Jewish question, which would make accessible the Jew problem to each student at our universities. All of that quoted. By contrast, and this is our good fortune, in many of today's American universities, including the University of Minnesota, programs of Jewish studies flourish. They've not been established, however, because of any perceived Jew problem, but out of the recognition that knowledge of Judaism and the Jews can add significantly to the understanding of major facets of both Western and Eastern cultures. Nevertheless, our universities, like the societies in which they exist, are not altogether free of a version of the Jewish question. It's not a version that anyone in his right mind, I hasten to add, believes requires a final solution, but it's troubling all the same. And some of the troubles relate to changing attitudes towards how the victims and perpetrators of the Nazi final solution of the Jewish question should be remembered, including how they should be presented in university teaching and research. Let me take you back in time. From the standpoint of the perpetrators, the genocide of the Jews was to be an unrecorded or silent crime, an unwritten and never to be written page of glory, as Heinrich Himmler put it in his famous speech delivered to SS officers in Poznan in October 1943. From the standpoint of the intended victims, the brutal persecutions and mass killings were a cause of deep anxiety. Jews in Nazi-dominated Europe feared not only that they would be murdered in large numbers, but that there would be no lasting record of their violent end. Looking back decades later, the Nazi camp survivor and Nobel laureate Imre Kertész recalls, and these are his words, from the very first moment when it was far from being revealed to the world, when it was as yet unnamed, from the very first moment there was a terrible anxiety, a fear of forgetfulness attached to the Holocaust. To counter forgetting, historians, including historians in this very room, have labored for decades to document, describe, and explain the history of the Third Reich and the Nazi campaign of oppression and elimination of subject peoples, the Jews foremost among them. Their work has been invaluable, and yet historical memory, broadly conceived in cultures like the ones we occupy today, depends less on the record of events drawn up by scholars, as valuable as that record is, than on the projection of these events by writers, filmmakers, artists, architects, museum designers, television producers and directors, and others. A review of their productions shows that Holocaust memory is a volatile area of contending images, interpretations, historical claims, and counterclaims. Far from being fixed, it is continually in flux, and that's increasingly so within our universities. Some proponents of genocide studies, for instance, decry ongoing attention to the Holocaust as being too narrow or too parochial, and argue that it's time to insert study of the Nazi crimes against the Jews into the broader comparative framework of their discipline. For instance, Mariana Hirsch of Columbia University and Irene Casandes, I think of Cornell, the editors of the book Teaching the Representation of the Holocaust, argue that because scholars who teach the Holocaust in the United States do so as part, and these are their words, of a people with its own troubled history of suffering, persecution, and genocide, an acknowledgement of the relation of Holocaust representation and memorialization to the representation of slavery and Native American genocide is fundamental to any Holocaust course taught in the United States. All of that quoted. In my view, the premises of their view need to be closely questioned. American scholars who offer courses on American slavery and the fate of Native Americans, after all, often feel no obligation to focus their curricula along comparative lines, but treat their subjects as fully sufficient unto themselves. But if they are right to do so, and I contend they are, why is a focus on the Holocaust deemed to be insufficient? And why is there a supposed need to encompass study of the Nazi crimes against the Jews within an American context that will expose students to what Hirsch and Casandes call, and I quote them again, the workings of racism and prejudice that we can find within our own culture. Racism and prejudice are well-established facts of American national life. But to date, they've not culminated in anything like Auschwitz or Treblinka. To situate study of the Nazi crimes against the Jews within a specifically American framework, therefore, risks distorting the histories of both the Nazi Holocaust and the American experience including the American experience of racism. The imperative to reorient Holocaust studies in this way is but one illustration among many of a growing impatience with the place of the Holocaust in American cultural life, which mirrors similar, even more strongly expressed feelings of dissatisfaction with Holocaust history and memory in parts of Europe and throughout the Muslim world. Other scholars argue that Holocaust studies, by awarding supreme victim status to the Jews, deny it to other victim groups, and thereby assign what they call a permanent privilege to the Jews alone. They are inclined to engage Holocaust history and memory polemically, claiming that it's part of a Zionist scheme to make Israel the beneficiary of universal sympathy through an exclusive concentration on Jewish suffering during the Nazi era. Moreover, Jews today are said to use their own past history of suffering as a pretext to inflict suffering on others. In the name of Auschwitz, it's sometimes alleged Jews are actively carrying out genocide against the Palestinians, who are commonly referred to within these rhetorical codes as the new Jews, the Israelis being figured as perpetrators on a par with the Nazis. To put an end to such alleged Jewish chauvinism, it's time, in the words of the theologian Mark Ellis, to end Auschwitz. That's his phrase. Or, as the influential French philosopher Alain Badiou puts it more bluntly, and I quote him, "The time has come to forget the Holocaust." And that precisely is what growing numbers of people seem intent on doing. Recent public opinion polls show that over 40% of people in European countries think that Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. In 5 of these countries, Austria, Germany, Hungary, Italy, and Poland, the figure is higher than 40%. In another poll, 42% of people in 8 different European countries believe that Jews exploit this past to extort money. The implications of these findings are troubling. They seem to suggest that a sizable part of the European population has heard all they want to hear about the tribulations of the Jews. They've grown tired and resentful of having to confront yet again stories of Jewish victimization and Jewish suffering. As Lord Baker of Dorking, who served for 3 years as British Education Secretary under Margaret Thatcher, recently put it, it's time to stop teaching British youngsters about the Holocaust. In his own words, "I would ban the study of Nazism from the history curriculum in Great Britain totally." In certain French schools, such courses are no longer taught. And if a new ruling by officials in the French Education Ministry stands up, the very words Shoah and Holocaust are to be removed from school curricula and textbooks, for their connotations are judged to be too specific to the Jewish experience. Instead, a more generalized French word for annihilation is recommended. In the United States, many colleges and universities continue to offer courses on the Nazi persecution and destruction of European Jewry. But at some of these institutions, faculty members feel under pressure to broaden the focus of what they teach and include other historical examples of mass violence as well. The idea is to avoid what's called a Jewish monopolization of suffering in order to broaden awareness of man's inhumanity to man in general. The same goals probably account for the conversion of institutes originally conceived as centers for the study of the Holocaust to centers of Holocaust and genocide studies, or Holocaust, genocide, and human rights studies, or Holocaust, genocide, and peace studies, etc. As part of this trend, the Holocaust as a genocidal crime against the Jews becomes recontextualized into a series of moral lessons about problems of injustice that periodically beset humanity as such. What might we conclude from these developments? While considerable attention continues to be given to stories of Jewish fate under the Nazis, Holocaust fatigue and Holocaust resentment seem to be on the increase. Many people, it appears, have had enough of the Jews and their sorrows and want relief from all that. Complaints about the hegemony of Jewish Holocaust memory and of a self-serving Holocaust industry are symptomatic of this changed mood. How much influence such negative reactions are likely to have is impossible to predict. But if these trends continue unchecked, Holocaust memory may be less compelling and also less sustainable in the years ahead than it has been in the recent past. If the history and the memory of the Holocaust are now contested in the ways I've just described, the same holds true, but even more so, of the State of Israel. Complaints about the two are often conjoined with calls for the end of Auschwitz, often emanating from the same people who publicly question the legitimacy and the right to a future of the State of Israel. Alain Badiou, already mentioned as an advocate of forgetting the Holocaust, also calls for the dissolution of Israel as a Jewish state. He's joined by numerous others who object to Jewish particularity as such and see it as an offense against a worldview that stresses what they take to be universalist principles and cosmopolitan emancipatory ideals. To such people, Jews as individuals may pose no serious problems, but the idea of corporate or collective Jewish existence, especially when established in the form of an independent Jewish state, is out of sync with the way they think social and political life should be organized. Add to this source of unease with the Jews the fact that in an age when many intellectuals endorse notions of post-nationalism, post-militarism, and an emphatic preference for secularism, the Jewish state has a strong national and religious character and a powerful army, and we see that the gap between a prominent strain of contemporary thinking and the Jews as an ethnic, religious, national entity widens. The tensions that accompany this divide frequently appear in the writings of today's anti-Zionists. Prominent among them, the late Tony Judd of NYU no doubt spoke for many when he pronounced Israel to be anachronistic and bad for the Jews and bad for just about everyone else, and called for the state's replacement by a binational state. Jett's hostility to Israel is widely shared on college and university campuses, where, as Stanley Fish describes it, and I quote him, anti-Israel sentiment flourishes and is regarded more or less as a default position. If then we're witnessing, as I contend, the emergence of new versions of the Jewish question, one of its most prominent strains is found right here in the Israel question. With the possible exception of the United States, no other country draws as much negative attention today as the State of Israel. On university campuses, Israel, in fact, plays something of the same role that it does at the United Nations. As Walter Laqueur reminds us, and I quote from Laqueur, some 25 million people have been killed in internal conflicts since World War II. Of them, about 8,000 in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which ranks 46th in the list of victims. And yet, Israel has been more often condemned by the UN than all other nations taken together. Israel, it goes without saying, is not blameless. No country is. But the criticisms heaped upon it at the United Nations are clearly out of proportion to the country's faults and reveal hostile passions at work. A similar hostility is displayed on campuses in an array of Israel-oriented programs that often carry well beyond legitimate critical discussion of specific Israeli policies to impassioned denunciations of the country as such and calls for its elimination. When one encounters campus-based lectures and conferences with titles like the following, and these are culled from university postings, Israel, the Fourth Reich, Israel and the Politics of Genocide, Zionism, America's Disease, From Auschwitz to Gaza, it's clear that a blatantly anti-Israel political agenda is operating. It aims to brand Zionism as a form of racism, to make Israel into an apartheid state on the model of South Africa, to accuse the country of committing the most brutal crimes against humanity, including ethnic cleansing and genocide, and to denounce its behavior as so evil as to be comparable to that of Nazi Germany. Add to all of this ideological animosity practical efforts to bar Israeli speakers from campuses, or otherwise to keep them from being heard by heckling them or shouting them down, guerrilla theater productions, or other campus happenings that feature the building of Israeli apartheid walls and staged die-ins of students dressed up like Arabs, supposedly massacred by other students dressed up like Israeli soldiers, leaflets and posters that routinely mingle the Star of David with the swastika and other versions of anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic graffiti, verbal abuse and sometimes physical assaults against Jewish students, the vandalism of Jewish property, plus such well-organized annual events as Israel Apartheid Week, now in its 8th year and held on dozens of campuses around the world, and boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns, add all of that up, and it's clear that universities have become popular venues for determined efforts to delegitimize and even to criminalize the State of Israel. On some campuses, the environment for Jewish students has become so strained as to bring about the filing of complaints with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, whose recent extension now includes the protection of the rights of Jewish students. The growing unease of some of these American students is paralleled by the experience of Jewish students at Canadian and British universities, some of whose campuses have long been hospitable to aggressive anti-Israel activists. In Great Britain, the leadership of the 120,000-member University and College Union issues annual calls for the institution of discriminatory measures against Israeli universities and academic scholars. This situation reached such a troubled point a few years ago as to bring Lady Deitch, former head of Oxford University's St. Anne's College, and also one-time adjudicator for higher education in Great Britain, to issue a statement that included these words, and I quote her: "Zionist has become a word of opprobrium. All Jews are so labeled. Once the equation is made between Zionism and Jews, anti-Semites then feel free to attack all Jewish students without distinction. Protests start as attacks on Israel and conclude with threats to all Jews." All of that quoted. In his comprehensive analysis of British anti-Semitism, Anthony Julius illustrates this latter point graphically, and I quote from Julius's book. At a meeting of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, a Hizb al-Tahrir activist stated, "Let's be open about this. The Quran does not mention Zionists, it mentions Jews. They are our enemy, and insha'Allah, we shall kill them." All of that quoted. This equation of Zionists and Jews has long been commonplace in the countries of the Middle East and now finds a home in some of the anti-Zionist discourse and anti-Jewish harassment on British and North American college campuses. It lends credence to Stanley Fish's contention, and these are his words, that when hostility to Israel comes, anti-Semitism is not far behind. To what degree such biases inform faculty sentiment and behavior is difficult to determine, but sufficient evidence already exists to confirm the reality of some highly questionable professional conduct. Consider the case of Michael Sinnott, a British professor at the University of Manchester, who, claiming to speak for many, denounces Israel, these are his words, as the mirror image of Nazism. Or the case of Mona Baker, his Manchester colleague, who dismisses two Israeli scholars from the editorial boards of two academic journals she manages solely on the basis of their nationality. "I can no longer live with the idea of Israelis as such," she said. Or consider Andrew Wilkie, a prominent scientist at Oxford University, who refuses to accept an Israeli graduate student into his laboratory because the student's resume shows he has done his obligatory national military service. Or Giulio Pino, a historian at Kent State University, who shouts out "Death to Israel" at a campus speech by a former Israeli diplomat. Or David Klein, a mathematician at California State University at Northridge, who thinks nothing of using his university-sponsored webpage to disseminate anti-Israel propaganda among his students, likening the Israeli army to the Nazi SS. A fuller compilation of incidents of this kind could easily be made. While such behavior is not typical of how most of us conduct ourselves, it's no longer rare and points to the emergence of an intensely negative, aggressively hostile mood towards Israel and its supporters. Troubled by manifestations of this mood on his own campus, former Harvard president Lawrence Summers criticized some of his colleagues and students for activities that were, as he called them, anti-Semitic in their effect, if not in their intent. This criticism did not go over well in Cambridge and may have contributed to his dismissal from the Harvard presidency. All the same, Summers was more accurate than not in describing attitudes towards Israel in the terms he used. The recent Harvard-based conference on the one-state solution, just held there in March, the one-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which basically promoted the idea of the dissolution of the Jewish state, is a case in point. As stated in the European Union's working definition of anti-Semitism, which our own State Department has adopted as this country's source for defining anti-Semitism, and I quote from both the EU statement and our own State Department statement, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, a right they have enjoyed since 1948, is a manifestation of anti-Semitism. So too is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, or of regarding Israel as a racist state, accusing Israel and the Jews of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, and numerous other instances of anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli vilification, denunciation, and demonization that appear on some campuses. To the degree that these become normalized, these defamatory views corrode the academic and moral integrity of university life, including what goes on in the classroom, lecture halls, and research and publication. They represent a clear betrayal of the humanities by encouraging forms of groupthink rather than independent reflection and analysis based on reason and supported by demonstrable evidence. At bottom, groupthink is invested in advocacy or indoctrination rather than the rigors of critical analysis and interpretation. As such, it's antithetical to one of the oldest and most important aims of the university, which is to promote a climate of free inquiry that will enable us to draw distinctions between truth and falsehood, what is real and what distorts and undermines our sense of reality. Some notable malformations of truth are visible today within certain well-known writings on Zionism in Israel by prominent academic scholars, as can be illustrated by looking briefly at such tendentious works as Jacqueline Rose's book, The Question of Zion, and John Mearsheimer's and Stephen Walt's book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. The first of these, written by a professor at London's Queen Mary University, is not only replete with egregious factual errors, but contains statements like the following, and I quote from Jacqueline Rose's book, "We take Zionism to be a form of collective insanity." To portray Zionism is not only mad, but morally corrupt. Rose manufactures blatantly false parallels between Zionism and Nazism, at one point linking Herzl and Hitler in an altogether bogus way, and I quote from her book. "It was the same Paris performance of Wagner," she writes, "when, without knowledge or foreknowledge of each other, Theodor Herzl and Adolf Hitler were both present on the same evening that inspired Herzl to write Der Judenstaat and Hitler Mein Kampf." Since, as we know, Herzl died in 1904, and Hitler never set foot in Paris until 1940, this story about them being together at the Paris Opera is entirely apocryphal, as are numerous other things in this book. None of that, however, kept Princeton University Press from publishing the book, a dubious undertaking for one of this country's otherwise premier academic presses, and probably explainable only because the press sensed that a damning book on Zionism, even if written by someone who had no credentials whatsoever as a scholar of the subject, would fit the current anti-Israel mood and sell well. Similar reasons must have led Farrar, Straus, and Giroux to reportedly give John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt a whopping advance of $750,000 to write The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Both authors are distinguished scholars in their own fields, but neither Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago nor Walt of Harvard had ever before written anything of note about Zionism or Israel. Unsurprisingly, their book has been rejected by just about everyone who's reviewed it as poorly conceived, ill-informed, simplistic in its analysis, and slipshod in its handling of evidence. In sum, there's virtual unanimity among scholars that this book is not serious scholarship. What then drives it? Since the author's argument implies that those who make up the Israel Lobby work determinedly and almost conspiratorially for a foreign power rather than in the American national interest, and thereby might be guilty of dual loyalty, the question has been frequently asked, does the book express an anti-Jewish bias? Walter Russell Mead, reviewing the work in Foreign Affairs, believes that the authors are not anti-Semites, but he then notes, and I quote him, "This may be a book that anti-Semites will love, but it's not necessarily an anti-Semitic book." Expanding on this notion, Mead adds, and these are his words, "The authors do what anti-Semites have always done. They overstate the power of Jews. The picture they paint calls up some of the ugliest stereotypes in anti-Semitic discourse. The Zionist octopus they conjure stirring up the Iraq War, manipulating both U.S. political parties, shaping the media, punishing the courageous minority of professors and politicians who dare to tell the truth, is depressingly familiar and makes their case harder to defend. Mead finds the Israel lobby to be insensitive and often incoherent, and he concludes, these are his words, that written in haste, the book will be repented at leisure. On this latter point, he's not been proven right. For far from expressing any regret over their work, Wald and Mearsheimer have reaped the rewards that come with open displays of anti-Israel animus. The Israel lobby has been translated to date into 21 foreign languages and sold hundreds of thousands of copies. In addition, it's brought Wald and Mearsheimer more lecture invitations in the few years that have passed since its publication than most professors can ever hope to receive in a lifetime. In short, precisely because the Israel lobby is a book that anti-Semites will love, Wald and Mearsheimer have won both fame and fortune. The only other author I can think of who rivals them in this regard is Norman Finkelstein, who likewise enjoys fame of a sort by producing pseudo-scholarship about the Jews. Although his deeply flawed book entitled The Holocaust Industry is not taken seriously by scholars of the Holocaust, it's had a wide readership, no doubt because it too is a work that anti-Semites will love. It now exists in 16 foreign languages, has also sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and has made its author a frequent speaker on the anti-Zionist campus lecture circuit. Both of these books tap into a popular strain of anti-Jewish feeling which is running high these days in certain circles and expresses itself in a conspiratorial sense of Jewish power. Wald and Mearsheimer locate this alleged power in the ability of Israel's supporters to redirect and essentially undermine America's national interests on behalf of the Jewish state. Finkelstein locates it in the ability of Jews to supposedly exploit the Holocaust for political and venal ends and to sell it to a gullible public. In fact, as conceptual categories, both the Israel lobby and the Holocaust industry are little more than polemically driven intellectual constructs assembled from a broad range of disparate phenomena, some of them half true, others not true at all, and ultimately far more the products of their authors' imaginations than they are cohesive entities that operate in the real world. To readers who've made both books bestsellers, though, these facts are irrelevant. What matters to them is that these authors have seemingly exposed well-organized, manipulative forms of Jewish power at work in important areas of political life, the media, and financial circles. Add Jacqueline Rose's assault, which portrays Zionism as inherently mad, violent, and unjust, and the result is an accumulating image of the Jews as a crafty and domineering people who use their allegedly excessive influence to the detriment of others and should be exposed as what they are, a malign and destructive social force. This is not an image of the Jews or of Israel that prevails in the American public at large, nor is it likely to ring true among most students and faculty members on American campuses. As every recent poll of European public opinion demonstrates, however, such negative attitudes towards Israel are now common in Europe, where they go hand in hand with feelings of impatience with Holocaust memory and resentment towards the Jews for keeping such memory alive. To the degree that such hostility is now finding a voice on American campuses, and it points to the emergence of a new version of the Jewish question, redefined as the Israel question, within sectors of some of our universities. I close on the following note. I'm certain that we're not right now looking at a reprise of the 1930s. But if the developments that I've described to you continue and become more widely embraced, we will be witnessing, to some degree, we're already witnessing, a serious challenge to the core missions of the university, which are to encourage free inquiry, discourage attachments to every kind of intellectual or ideological bias or dogma, and search out truths that reasonable people can agree are demonstrable and worthy of serious attention. When we remain faithful to such goals, the humanities do have a strong chance of humanizing, but they can never do so if they're employed to dehumanize the Jews or anyone else. Thank you.